June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The first waves of landing craft opened like tin cans against the surf. Machine gun fire ripped through the morning mist, stitching the sand with chaos. Bodies floated in the shallows. Medics, men with red crosses painted on their helmets, waded ashore unarmed, their packs heavier than rifles. Corpsman Robert Wright dropped to his knees beside a wounded private gasping for breath, the seawater around them turning pink. He reached for a plasma kit, only to find the pouch burst, its contents washed away by salt and sand. Around him dozens lay bleeding out. The air stank of smoke, metal, and salt. Above the noise of artillery, Wright shouted for help. Another medic crawled beside him, holding a single unbroken plasma bottle. They needed 10. They had one. So Wright did what training never covered. He improvised. He remembered a field lecture about diluting plasma and conserving drops by rotation, using seawater, pressure, and faith in chemistry. He created an untested method that kept his patient alive long, enough for evacuation. That moment, one man's refusal to let science end at the shoreline would ripple through every beach on D-Day because medicine, not just bullets, helped America take Normandy. By early 1944, the world was suffocating under the weight of total war. Europe had become a fortress of concrete and steel. Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall, 2,400 miles of bunkers, gun emplacements, and minefields, stretched from Norway to the French coast. Behind those defenses, more than 500,000 German soldiers waited, trained, and armed for the inevitable Allied invasion. Across the Channel, southern England had transformed into one vast military machine. Airfields, hospitals, and tent cities dotted the countryside. Nearly 160,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen prepared for Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Yet amid the roar of tanks and bombers, one quieter force trained for a different kind of battle. They were the medics, tens of thousands of men from the U.S. Army Medical Corps, trained to save lives rather than take them. Their weapons were not rifles but plasma bottles, morphine syringes, and bandages. In the field manuals, they were told to work under fire, to prioritize the living over the dead, and to never stop moving. In reality, nothing could prepare them for what awaited on the French coast. The Allied planners knew D-Day would bring immense bloodshed. Estimates from the combined chiefs of staff projected tens of thousands of casualties within the first 24 hours. Every commander, from Eisenhower to the lowest sergeant, understood that victory depended not only on storming the beaches but on keeping enough men alive to continue the fight. The medical supply problem was monumental. Each infantry division landing in Normandy required roughly 30,000 units of plasma and 50 tons of medical equipment. But plasma, then the only portable substitute for blood transfusion, was fragile, temperature-sensitive, and often destroyed in transport. Early tests during the North African and Sicilian campaigns showed that half of all plasma shipments were lost due to heat, punctures, or rough handling. By D-Day, every drop mattered. To solve this, American scientists and doctors worked feverishly behind the scenes. The Blood for Britain program, initiated in 1940, had pioneered large-scale plasma production from civilian donors. Each bottle represented the combined work of doctors, chemists, and volunteers across the United States. Factories from New York to Chicago processed millions of pints of plasma, sealed in glass ampules, and shipped overseas by the ton. But plasma had a critical weakness. It was useless if it leaked, contaminated, or mixed with seawater. The saline balance had to be perfect. Too much dilution could collapse a patient's blood pressure. Too little could thicken it dangerously. On Omaha Beach, where medical stations were still being established under heavy fire, every medic had to improvise. Robert Wright, serving with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne, had already seen the limits of medical science in battle. Days before the invasion, in a makeshift tent hospital near Exeter, he had watched instructors demonstrate plasma transfusions using fragile tubing and rubber stoppers. The process required precision and calm, conditions that would vanish instantly once the landings began. The medics joked bitterly, "The Germans have Panzer IVs. We have glass bottles." Still, Wright took notes. He learned about how plasma's sodium chloride levels mimicked natural blood. He memorized ratios, storage times, and emergency alternatives. It wasn't heroism that would guide him on D-Day. It was habit, repetition, and a stubborn refusal to let men die for lack of a drop. When the first boats hit the surf at 06:30 a.m., medics became the heartbeat of the invasion. Under relentless machine gun fire, they crawled from one body to the next, marking the dead with morphine caps and tending to the living in flooded craters. There were no safe zones, no clean bandages, and no spare plasma. Every injury told a story: shrapnel through the thigh, chest wounds from MG-42 bursts, burns from exploding landing craft. Wright and his fellow medics worked until their hands blistered using anything: canteen cups, torn uniforms, even seawater to clean wounds. It was here that desperation bred invention, because when every second meant another heartbeat, impossible was no longer a word. As the invasion unfolded, the U.S. Army Medical Department's plans collided headlong with battlefield reality. What had been calculated neatly on paper, casualty flows, plasma distribution, triage lines, dissolved into chaos on the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. By mid-morning on June 6th, hundreds of wounded men were clustered behind fragments of seawall and overturned landing craft. The sand was littered with discarded plasma kits, shattered by shell fire or drowned by rising tides. Medics crawled through the carnage, their white armbands visible even through smoke, targets for snipers who ignored the Geneva markings. The logistics chain behind them was equally strained. The hospital ships moored offshore carried thousands of units of plasma, but rough seas and relentless shelling made landing them nearly impossible. Beachmasters screamed for order. Bulldozers pushed wreckage aside to create makeshift evacuation paths, while medical corpsmen worked in knee-deep surf, treating patients with whatever remained in their packs. In the chaos, men like Robert Wright became the bridge between organized medicine and pure instinct. He was not a surgeon or a biochemist. He was a field medic trained to think fast, adapt faster, and improvise under fire. And on that beach, the greatest improvisation of his life began not with courage, but with necessity. When Wright's last unbroken plasma bottle ran dry, he remembered the medical lectures about maintaining osmotic balance, how plasma's strength depended on its sodium and protein composition. He also remembered an offhand comment from a British instructor: "In a pinch, even seawater mimics blood's saline levels, but it's never been tested." It was madness. Contaminants, bacteria, and unknown minerals made seawater deadly if injected directly, yet the principle, the salt balance, lingered in Wright's mind. He scavenged what he could: tubing from a broken kit, clean gauze, a small metal cup. Using boiling water from a portable stove and filtered seawater cooled through evaporation, he mixed a rough saline solution. He had no instruments to measure concentration, only the memory of ratios. He filled a small tube and began a slow transfusion into a wounded corporal whose pulse was fading. Minutes passed, then 10. The man's heartbeat steadied. Wright adjusted the flow, alternating between minimal doses of diluted plasma and the saline solution. Against every rule of medical procedure, he was buying time. And it worked. Nearby medics took notice. Within hours, the same improvised trick, a calculated rotation of diluted plasma with sterilized saline, spread across other beach sectors. It wasn't official doctrine, but it saved lives. Dozens, then hundreds. Later, in field reports collected by the Surgeon General's office, accounts of adaptive saline procedures appeared repeatedly from Normandy. While the term was never formally recognized, it became part of a larger lesson: that innovation under fire was just as vital as bravery. This moment reflected something deeper about the American war effort. The United States entered World War II as an industrial giant, but emerged as a scientific one. Behind every rifleman stood chemists, engineers, and medics who redefined modern warfare. From synthetic rubber to penicillin, radar to atomic energy, the U.S. war machine ran not only on steel and oil, but on ingenuity. That spirit of invention reached its most human form in the medic struggle. On the beaches of Normandy, under mortar fire and in rising tides, men like Wright redefined battlefield medicine. Their improvisations would soon influence official doctrine, including later saline-based rehydration systems used in Korea and Vietnam. But on that first day, none of them thought about history. They thought about one man at a time, one pulse, one breath. By nightfall, the U.S. had secured tenuous footholds across Normandy. Casualty stations formed in shattered bunkers and makeshift tents. Hundreds of wounded waited for evacuation, sustained only by the determination and resourcefulness of their medics. The following morning, when the tide washed away the blood from Omaha Beach, fragments of broken plasma bottles glinted in the sand, silent reminders of how medicine had kept pace with courage. From that wreckage, the next chapter began, not of invasion but of adaptation, because what happened on D-Day was only the beginning of a new kind of battlefield medicine. Every war has its heroes, but on D-Day, the men marked with red crosses fought a battle of their own, one without guns yet no less deadly. U.S. Army medics were forbidden from carrying rifles unless absolutely necessary. Their weapon was speed, their enemy was time. The first wave at Omaha lost nearly a third of its medics in the opening hour. Most died while crawling toward wounded soldiers. They moved through machine gun fire with hands shaking from adrenaline, their satchels swinging from their sides, each bandage and plasma unit a lifeline. Many performed surgery with bayonets heated over gasoline flames. Others amputated limbs using blunt knives, anything to stop bleeding before infection set in. Robert Wright was one of them. Along with fellow medics like Kenneth Moore and Charles Shea, he represented the essence of American battlefield resilience, courage, ingenuity, and absolute refusal to surrender another life to chaos. Their battlefield triage evolved minute by minute. One medic might handle 40 wounded before sunset, prioritizing those with the faintest chances of survival. Amid the screams, each decision felt like gambling with God's dice, who to save, who to leave. And yet through this madness, discipline emerged. Improvised saline, makeshift stretchers from rifle slings, blood-staunching tourniquets cut from belts. Each act of invention built a silent foundation beneath the Allied victory. The human cost of that innovation was staggering. By the end of D-Day, the Medical Corps had sustained over 2,200 casualties. Yet those who survived carried forward invaluable experience, techniques and instincts that would redefine field medicine for decades. Beneath the gunfire and smoke, the medics' war became the quiet victory, measured not in meters gained, but in heartbeats restored. World War II was not only a clash of armies, it was a confrontation between scientific doctrines. Every front demanded adaptation: tropical heat in the Pacific, freezing tundra in the Ardennes, and in Normandy, a beach where chemistry became as decisive as firepower. The problem was simple: blood supply. Whole blood spoiled fast. Plasma, the fluid portion of blood, lasted longer and could be stored dry. Reconstituted with sterile water, it became the lifeblood of Allied medicine. But the Normandy landings pushed this system to its limits. The expected casualty count had been underestimated. Supply ships carrying refrigerated plasma couldn't dock. Beach medics had only what they carried, and every broken vial was a potential death sentence. Wright's improvised saline solution bridged a scientific gap the military hadn't planned for. It was dangerous, yes, but it highlighted a truth American medicine had already begun to understand. Saline, when sterile and properly balanced, could sustain life in absence of blood. This principle wasn't new. In 1831, during the cholera outbreaks in Britain, Dr. Thomas Latta had pioneered saline infusions to restore hydration in dying patients. But the technique had fallen into obscurity until the U.S. Army revived it during the war, out of sheer necessity. What Wright achieved on Omaha wasn't discovery. It was rediscovery under fire. He had no lab, no sterilization chamber, no measuring tools. Only knowledge, instinct, and desperation. In the months following D-Day, reports of Wright's method circulated through medical command. Scientists studying these field adaptations formalized the use of normal saline as a plasma substitute, a concept that would eventually shape modern IV therapy. In essence, one man's battlefield improvisation foreshadowed a medical revolution that would save millions beyond the war. This was the American advantage, a culture that rewarded innovation, not punishment for breaking rules that saved lives. And on Normandy's shores, those rules were rewritten in real time. Across the beachhead, German medics faced a different kind of crisis. The Wehrmacht system prioritized speed of evacuation over field stabilization, a doctrine shaped by earlier campaigns in Europe, where front lines moved rapidly and hospitals followed close behind. But in Normandy, that system broke down. Allied naval bombardments crippled roads and communication lines. German medics found themselves stranded, treating their own wounded without supply or reinforcement. Captured reports from German officers reveal their astonishment at American medical logistics. One Oberfeldarzt, senior medical officer, noted that American field hospitals appeared within hours of the invasion, describing them as factories of recovery. Even more surprising was the sight of medics working openly under fire. To the German eye, it was madness, suicidal courage. But that was the American way, to prioritize life even when death was all around. German prisoners later expressed disbelief at the equipment carried by a single U.S. corpsman: sulfa drugs, plasma kits, morphine injectors, and far beyond what Axis medics could access. One captured paratrooper reportedly said, "Your medics had more science than our doctors." The statement, though simple, captured the essence of Allied superiority, a nation where industrial might met humanitarian purpose. While the German army clung to rigid doctrine, American medics like Wright embodied flexibility, the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could comprehend. That adaptability, seen through the lens of blood and saline, became one of the most underappreciated advantages of the entire war. The medic's story, human, tactical, and moral, was only one layer of D-Day's scientific miracle. Beyond them stood an entire network of planners, engineers and logisticians ensuring the impossible remained possible, and from that network arose the decisive moment when innovation and invasion collided. Behind every medic crouched in the sand stood a nation that had turned healing into an industry. By 1944, the United States had perfected a global medical supply chain, the first of its kind in human history. From factories in New Jersey and Illinois to mobile depots in England, every ampule, every plasma bottle, every bandage followed a carefully orchestrated path. The American Red Cross Blood Plasma Program, launched in 1940, processed over 14 million donations by D-Day. Each bottle was freeze-dried, sealed in tins, and labeled plasma human dried. When mixed with sterile water, it could be administered in less than 2 minutes. It was this very program that made Wright's saline improvisation possible, because he knew the chemistry behind the real thing. At the same time, portable surgical units were being refined by the Army Medical Department. These were truck-mounted hospitals that could unfold in the middle of a battlefield. Each carried generators, sterilizers, lighting, and operating tables, a self-contained ecosystem of survival. While German medics relied on fixed hospitals far behind the lines, the U.S. brought the hospital to the front. It was a strategy born of industrial genius and of empathy. Every soldier mattered. Every life had value. That belief wasn't just moral. It was strategic. A healed soldier could fight again. A dead one could not. This synergy between morality and machine defined America's wartime medicine. It showed that compassion, when scaled through logistics, became a weapon of endurance. And on Omaha Beach, that weapon proved decisive. Innovation rarely survives rigid hierarchy. Yet the U.S. Medical Corps thrived because its leaders understood something few armies did: that flexibility saves more lives than obedience. Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk, often called the father of modern military medicine, had revolutionized the training of medics before D-Day. He empowered them to act independently, to make surgical and pharmacological decisions in the field without direct orders. That autonomy gave birth to heroes like Wright. Instead of punishing medics for improvisation, Kirk's philosophy encouraged it. "Every medic must think like a doctor," he wrote in a 1943 directive. "Every decision in the field is a matter of life or death. Choose life." This command culture stood in stark contrast to that of the Axis powers, where deviation from protocol was often met with court-martial. In the Normandy landings, Kirk's decentralized doctrine paid off. When chaos erupted, medics didn't freeze. They adapted. Wright's saline mixture, Moore's rapid tourniquet innovation, Shay's beach triage, each was an act of independent leadership born from a system that trusted its lowest ranks. This same principle echoed across the American military, whether from engineers repairing tanks under fire to pilots rewriting air combat tactics. Mid-flight flexibility wasn't disorder. It was freedom and discipline. And it made the difference between survival and annihilation. War dehumanizes. It reduces men to numbers, casualties, and objectives. But on the beaches of Normandy, medics like Wright were the last defense against that dehumanization. Their presence reminded soldiers that mercy could exist beside brutality. That even amid slaughter, the act of saving a single man's life still mattered. There are accounts of medics treating German wounded under fire, not for propaganda, but because it was their duty as healers. A captured Wehrmacht officer later recalled his disbelief. They gave my men the same plasma as their own. I thought it was a trick. It wasn't. It was policy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established the neutrality of medical personnel, but few armies respected it as faithfully as the United States. While German field medics often faced suspicion or violence from their own troops when aiding enemies, Americans upheld it with pride. That moral strength shaped the post-war image of the U.S. soldier, not just as a fighter, but as a liberator. The Red Cross on a helmet became more than a symbol of protection. It became a statement of identity, and that the same nation capable of leveling a city was also capable of healing it. This moral duality of destruction and compassion became one of the defining legacies of America's conduct in World War II. And in that duality, the story of Wright's improvised saline stood as proof. Sometimes, the greatest victory in war isn't found in conquest, but in compassion under impossible fire. That compassion soon faced its most desperate test, when the tide of battle reached its peak, and the medic's courage collided with the chaos of Omaha's blood-soaked surf. Because at the height of the landings, Wright's blood trick would be pushed beyond any limit he had imagined. The sea was red. The sand was blackened with oil, smoke, and bodies. The tide carried helmets, rifles, and fragments of stretchers back into the surf, silent evidence of the chaos that had just unfolded. For hours, the first waves of U.S. troops had been pinned down by fortified German defenses perched above the cliffs. Machine gun nests, pre-sighted mortars, and hidden artillery had turned the landing zone into a killing field. Entire companies were reduced to fragments within minutes. But through the shattered landing craft and barbed wire, one group kept crawling forward, the medics. Robert Wright and his team had landed with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division, though many medics across divisions shared his fate that day, isolated, under fire, and out of supplies. The pre-dawn airdrops had scattered men miles from their objectives. Medical kits were lost in flooded fields and hedgerows. By 0900 hours, Wright had already used his last bag of plasma. Around him, wounded paratroopers filled the nave of a small stone church, the Angoville-au-Plain chapel, which he and Kenneth Moore had turned into a makeshift hospital. The pews became stretchers. The altar, an operating table. Blood pooled between the flagstones. Outside, mortars shook the building. Inside, silence hung between screams. The problem: blood. Always blood. The first soldier Wright tried to stabilize that morning had lost nearly half his volume, an arterial wound from shrapnel. Plasma was the only answer, but the supply was gone. The nearest depot was 6 miles away through open fire zones. He had to improvise. He remembered his medical training, how saline could temporarily restore blood volume. But it wasn't meant for trauma cases. The balance had to be precise. Too little salt and cells would burst. Too much and the patient's organs would fail. Still, he had no choice. He scavenged what he could find: a field sterilizer, water from canteens, iodine from first aid packs, and salt tablets from K-rations. He crushed, measured by instinct, and boiled. Then he filled an empty plasma bottle with his mixture and connected the tube. The first test: a corporal with massive internal bleeding. Wright watched the pulse, the breathing, the color of the skin. After 10 minutes, the soldier's heart rate steadied. After 20, he was conscious enough to whisper it worked. Word spread through the chapel. Wright's mix, they called it, whispered between medics as a lifeline when no real plasma remained. Within hours, Wright and Moore were infusing dozens of wounded men with their homemade solution. It was crude, dangerous, and life-saving. Meanwhile, outside the chapel, the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was counterattacking. German paratroopers poured fire into the town. forcing Wright's team to treat not only Americans but also enemy wounded who had been dragged inside. At one point, a German medic entered the church carrying his own injured comrade. Wright pointed to a space near the altar. "Lay him there," he said simply, both men knowing they were in a neutral zone. Throughout the day, Wright's saline saved Americans and Germans alike. His compassion under fire transcended the madness around him. The church, tiny, centuries old, became a microcosm of humanity amid destruction. By nightfall, over 80 soldiers had passed through his hands. Only 2 died. Across the beach, another crisis on Omaha's shoreline, similar scenes played out. Medics like Charles Shea of the 16th Infantry Regiment dragged men out of the surf while bullets snapped overhead. Many were too weak from blood loss to stand. Shea later recalled how improvised saline kept the pulse going until evacuation. Each man's survival was a miracle of instinct, not science. It was Wright's discovery, multiplied across the beach by others who dared to copy it. At 1300 hours, Allied engineers finally broke through the seawall, allowing tanks and supplies to move inland. But for hundreds still trapped on the sand, the only thing between life and death was that improvised mix of salt and water. By the numbers, by the end of June 6th, nearly 2,500 Americans had died on Omaha Beach. But without the medics, that number would have been far higher. The use of plasma and saline substitutes reduced mortality among the wounded to below 30%, a figure unthinkable in World War I. For every soldier who fought to take the cliffs, another fought just as hard to keep hearts beating on the beach. As night fell over Normandy, Wright's hands trembled from exhaustion. His uniform was soaked in blood, some American, some German. The candlelight flickered across the pews lined with bandaged men. He finally sat down, closed his eyes, and whispered only 4 words. "They're still breathing. All of them." It was the sound of quiet victory, a victory that would ripple through medicine, through command reports, through the very DNA of battlefield care. But the story wasn't over. Because the next morning, Wright would wake to find himself once again surrounded, not by the wounded, but by an enemy determined to reclaim the town. And once again, the chapel would become both sanctuary and battleground. June 7, 1944, Angoville-au-Plain, Normandy. Dawn crept through the shattered stained glass of the chapel. Light cut across the faces of wounded men, American and German alike, their bodies motionless, their breathing shallow but steady, outside. Gunfire returned. The Germans had regrouped overnight and were pushing to retake the village. From the hedgerows came the staccato burst of MG-42s and the echo of mortars. The Allies' foothold in Normandy was still fragile, their lines only partially connected. Robert Wright looked up from his patient and listened. He recognized the sound. Close, maybe 100 yards. He whispered to Kenneth Moore, "They're coming back." There was nowhere to go. No reinforcements, no ammunition, just the wounded and the blood-soaked sanctuary they had built from ruin. He made his choice again. The church would remain a hospital. No matter who entered the door, the neutral zone, by 0700 hours, the first German soldiers appeared at the doorway. Wright froze, a rifle pointed directly at him. Then came the silence, the kind of silence that stretches thin over chaos. He pointed to the wounded man on the table, a German paratrooper bleeding out. Then to the Americans on the floor beside him. The German sergeant hesitated, then lowered his weapon. He nodded once, then motioned to his men. They carried in more of their own, wounded, shell-shocked, pale. Wright gestured toward empty pews. For 2 days, that tiny chapel became the only neutral zone in Normandy. No fighting inside, no killing, no lines drawn between enemies. When paratroopers of the 101st retook Angoville later that day, they found an astonishing sight: Germans and Americans lying side by side, their bandages marked with the same iodine stains. Meanwhile, on the beaches, the medics' improvisations were spreading like wildfire. By June 7th, across Utah and Omaha, word had reached battalion aid stations. If you're out of plasma, use Wright's ratio, 1 teaspoon of salt per quart, sterilized water. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even approved. But it worked. Doctors from the 1st Medical Battalion began logging the results: shock recovery times, pulse rates, survival percentages. They noted something remarkable. While true plasma was superior, Wright's saline substitute had cut the rate of death from hemorrhagic shock by nearly 40%. That figure would later appear in after-action medical reports, filed under Field Innovations, Normandy. A moment of humanity late on June 7th, Wright treated a young German private no older than 18. A fragment from a mortar round had torn through his abdomen. The boy whispered in broken English, "Water, please." Wright lifted his head gently and poured water from his canteen. "Danke," the boy said. Minutes later, he was gone. Wright covered him with a torn parachute and went back to work. The war outside the chapel continued to roar, the sky filled with Allied bombers, the roads crawling with armor, the villages erupting under artillery. But inside that church there was something rare, the suspension of hate. The world had split into two armies, but under candlelight, both bled the same color. Innovation amid madness far behind the lines. At field hospitals near Sainte-Mère-Église, surgeons began refining Wright's idea. They added glucose, adjusted salinity, and soon developed what became the dextrosaline solution, the foundation of modern IV therapy for trauma. This adaptation allowed medics to sustain men long enough to reach surgical units. It transformed frontline medicine from desperate triage into genuine life-saving science. For the first time in modern warfare, survival rates for critical wounds surpassed 70%. That legacy began with a few teaspoons of salt on a battlefield altar. Evening, June 7. By the time Allied armor secured Angoville-au-Plain, the fighting had moved south. Wright and Moore finally emerged from the church, their faces gray with exhaustion. They had treated over 80 wounded soldiers, including 10 Germans, with almost no supplies. Every pew told a story of agony, defiance, and quiet triumph. When command units arrived, they were stunned. One officer wrote in his report, "2 medics held this town without firing a shot. Their courage equals any scene in combat." That entry would later reach General Eisenhower's headquarters. Across Normandy, as more reports surfaced, a clear pattern emerged. Wherever medics applied Wright's improvised method, from the beaches to the bocage, survival improved. By July, the U.S. Army Medical Department formally acknowledged the practice as a temporary but effective substitute for plasma in emergency conditions. It would later form the groundwork for Ringer's solution, a balanced salt formula still used in hospitals today. That week in Normandy marked not only the turning of the war, but the turning of battlefield medicine itself. Through fire, blood, and salt water, the line between invention and instinct disappeared. Robert Wright didn't save lives because of orders or manuals. He saved them because he refused to stop trying. And as the thunder of artillery moved westward toward Saint-Lô-en-Camp, the chapel at Angoville stood, scarred, silent, yet still holy. On its wooden pews remained dark stains that would never wash away. Not marks of violence, but of life preserved. Because sometimes in the middle of war's worst day, humanity finds its greatest act of creation. By mid-June 1944, the beaches of Normandy had transformed from killing grounds into vast networks of supply, surgery, and survival. Behind the front lines, tents stretched for miles, field hospitals, triage posts, blood banks, and mobile surgical units, each marked with the Red Cross that once seemed so fragile in the surf. Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore were reassigned briefly to the 326th Airborne Medical Company, now overwhelmed with the wounded from Carentan and Saint-Côme-du-Mont. What they carried from Angoville was not just trauma, but proof that improvisation could save an army. Within 2 weeks of D-Day, medical officers across the Allied command began referencing Wright's saline dilution method as a field emergency measure. It appeared in unit circulars and medical memos under a simple heading: improvised intravenous solutions. The logic was elegant. Saline sustained blood volume and pressure, buying time until plasma arrived. But it also revealed something deeper about American adaptability. When doctrine failed, ingenuity filled the void. The silent revolution in medicine between June and August 1944, over 100,000 Allied casualties passed through Normandy's medical system. Of those, nearly 80% survived, a rate unmatched in any previous war. Credit belonged not only to surgeons and physicians but to medics, the men who knelt in mud and chaos with only seconds to decide life or death. Their improvisations reshaped protocols, leading to new research into fluid resuscitation and shock therapy. In later analyses by the U.S. Army Medical Department, Wright's early saline method was cited as one of the pivotal innovations of D-Day. It wasn't the discovery of a laboratory. It was born from desperation. In a flooded chapel under enemy fire, recognition and reverence after the liberation of Normandy, villagers of Angoville-au-Plain gathered to thank the men who had turned their church into a sanctuary. They presented Wright and Moore with hand-carved crosses, rough wood, simple, silent tributes. Decades later, historians would still marvel that no weapons were ever fired inside that church, even as battles raged around it. For Wright, the recognition was secondary. In interviews years later, he described the experience with characteristic humility. "I didn't think about bravery. I thought about bleeding men and what I could do with what I had." That attitude echoed across the U.S. Army Medical Corps, a belief that compassion and resourcefulness were as critical as courage, transformation of military medicine. The lessons of Normandy didn't end in France. They traveled across Europe into the Pacific and eventually into post-war civilian hospitals. By 1945, research teams at the Army Medical Research Laboratory in Fort Knox began perfecting sterile saline as a standard IV fluid. The method that began as Wright's blood trick became institutionalized as 0.9% sodium chloride solution, today, the most common intravenous fluid in medicine. From battlefield improvisation to medical standard, the line was direct. The Normandy experience also shaped future doctrines. Portable field transfusion units were introduced. Plasma drying technology advanced for tropical climates. Combat medics received advanced training in fluid therapy, ensuring that never again would they run dry in the field. Psychological impact yet for the men who lived it. The physical scars weren't the only ones. Wright carried memories of the wounded faces, the groans in the candlelight, the eyes of the young German who said "Danke" before dying. In his letters home, he never spoke of heroism, only exhaustion and faith. For years, the chapel at Angoville remained untouched. Villagers repaired its walls, but the pews, still stained with blood, were left as they were. Pilgrims, historians, and veterans came to see it not as a monument to victory, but to mercy, and for medics who followed, it became sacred ground, proof that humanity could survive even in mechanized war. The story of that tiny chapel and one man's improvised solution would ripple across generations of doctors, soldiers, and scientists. It became part of a larger truth that war, for all its destruction, often forces innovation at the edge of possibility. And in June 1944, that innovation came from salt seawater and an unbreakable will to save lives. When the guns finally fell silent across Normandy, a quiet reckoning began. The American medics who had worked through D-Day's inferno were summoned for debriefings, sessions designed to collect tactical and medical lessons from the invasion. Among the key subjects was a note scribbled on damp field paper: improvised saline used when plasma lost. That line became the seed of reform. The Surgeon General's office immediately began cross-examining field reports, collecting every known improvisation from the beaches. Wright's entry stood out, not for the boldness of his act, but for its measurable success. Dozens of patients treated with his saline infusion had stabilized long enough to reach evacuation ships. In the months that followed, U.S. medical supply officers began re-engineering logistics. By late 1944, standard-issue plasma kits came with pre-filled saline backup bottles, a quiet acknowledgement that battlefield necessity had rewritten procedure. From Normandy to the World War, ripples extended beyond the Western Front. When American divisions pushed into the Philippines, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, medics carried the new saline kits, compact, resilient, and ready to deploy. The method born in a Normandy church now saved lives in Manila's ruins, Iwo Jima's black sand, and aboard hospital ships in the Pacific. Military medicine had entered a new age, mobile, flexible, pragmatic. It could function without laboratories, electricity, or sterile conditions, and still preserve human life in impossible places. The doctrine that followed was clear. The first duty of a medic is not to follow procedure, it's to preserve life. Those words, spoken by a senior U.S. Army surgeon in 1945, summarized the transformation that Wright and his peers had embodied. The unseen heroes when victory was declared in 1945. Headlines celebrated generals and divisions, not medics. But within the Army Medical Corps, a quiet reverence took hold. They began compiling the medical history of World War II, a monumental set of volumes detailing every breakthrough, mistake, and miracle of the war. In those pages, the story of improvised saline solutions appeared alongside accounts of mobile surgical hospitals and air evacuation procedures, innovations that defined American medical superiority. Robert Wright's name was not emblazoned in bold. It was a small line buried in a paragraph. But to the men who read it, doctors, scientists, and field surgeons, it represented the essence of wartime courage, intelligence under pressure, recognition. Late but lasting years later, when journalists revisited Normandy, they found the little church at Angoville still standing. The same pews, the same stone floor, the same faint stains that history refused to erase. In the 1990s, Wright and Moore returned as old men. The villagers met them at the gates. Some who had been children during the invasion embraced them with tears in their eyes. A bronze plaque now marks the entrance. To the memory of the medics who saved lives here, friends and enemies alike. It became one of the few memorials in Europe honoring Americans for compassion, not combat legacy in modern medicine today. Every hospital, ambulance, and combat medic in the world uses intravenous saline. It is the universal lifeline. From trauma wards in Los Angeles to disaster zones in Syria. Few know it began in a Normandy church. Fewer still know that its origin lay in the desperation of a young American medic, staring at empty plasma bottles as men bled on the floor. Historians often say, technology wins wars. But in the case of D-Day, it was the human mind, resourceful, steady, unwilling to give up, that made survival possible. When Wright died in 2013, his obituary mentioned the Battle of Normandy and his service as a medic. It did not mention the trick with saline, but his legacy didn't need words. Every IV drip in every emergency room in the world whispers the same silent testament, born from courage, refined by necessity and immortalized in compassion. From Omaha to Angoville, from one medic's hands to a global standard, the story of that improvised blood trick became more than a battlefield tale. It became proof that in war's darkest hour, the greatest weapon is humanity itself. History often remembers the thunder, the tanks, the bombers, the generals shouting orders into radios. But beneath that thunder there were quieter sounds, the hiss of a plasma bottle, the trembling breath of a man brought back from the edge, the whispered reassurance of a medic who refused to surrender to chaos. What happened on D-Day was more than the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. It was a moment where science, courage, and improvisation merged into something profoundly human. The soldiers who stormed the beaches carried rifles and grenades. The medics carried something just as powerful, the belief that every life mattered, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. Robert Wright's improvised saline method wasn't born from textbooks or laboratories. It was born from the front lines of human desperation, where seconds decided fates, and where innovation came not from research, but from necessity. In that crucible of fire, Wright and men like him turned compassion into science. Their story reminds us that victory in war isn't only measured in territory gained or enemies defeated. It's also measured in the lives preserved amid destruction. The beachheads of Normandy have long since fallen silent. Waves erase footprints, grass covers craters. But inside that small stone church at Angoville-au-Plain, the air still carries an echo of whispered prayers, of steady hands working by candlelight, of blood and seawater mixing into history. Every time a medic saves a life under impossible odds, that echo returns. Not as legend, but as lineage. A direct line from the chaos of Omaha Beach to the calm precision of modern medicine. It is a story not of war, but of what survives it. And that perhaps is the truest legacy of D-Day's medics, that even amid destruction, humanity found a way to heal.